By Mr. Rushdie insulting religion in his writing. Well, the US Secretary of State accused Iran's state media of gloating about the attack. Mr. Rushdie was left severely injured after being stabbed at an event in New York State. He's now able to breathe unaided. There have been calls for the West to stop holding talks with Iran about resuming the nuclear deal. Well, let's talk now to Behnam Taleblu, who focuses on Iranian security issues for the Foundation of Defense of Democracies in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us on the context. Let me ask you, first of all, should the US, do you think, step back from negotiations on the nuclear deal in light of what's happened here?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Mariam. In essence, yes, but there were many more predicates in the past year and a half of indirect nuclear diplomacy between the U.S. and other members of the P5+1 and the Islamic Republic of Iran and Vienna that should have necessitated a step back, a recalibration, and a move towards what many would call a Plan B or a pressure strategy against the Islamic Republic. There is the regime's atrocious human rights record. There is the crackdown of massive protests in Iran, particularly those that we saw rising up in May. There is the regime's continued missile, nuclear, and military advances, as well as the export of the revolution and support for terrorism, as well as the threats against U.S. officials, as well as the threats against U.S. citizens, as well as the threats against dissidents, and then layering on this latest attempt on the life of the writer Salman Rushdie. So the question is, at what point will Washington walk away if this is still not enough? Okay,
but the internal travails and problems in Iran are not what is the focus for the international community right now. They are thinking about Iran's nuclear capability and nuclear potential. And many would argue that being in negotiations is always going to be a lot more helpful, even if they are in many ways flawed, than taking a step back.
Potentially, and one could understand the logic of that, engagement with one's adversary. But the problem is when one's adversary understands that there is no willingness to move beyond diplomacy. And in this sense, this is really why the Islamic Republic has remained at the table, because it's been able to prevent Washington from moving towards a more confrontational approach. It's been able to use the ongoing talks as a political shield against prospective Israeli military action. All the meanwhile growing the scale, scope, and quality of its nuclear escalation while diminishing the monitoring and verification capabilities of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it's been able to use negotiations and the West's obsession with the concept of negotiations to further along its nuclear program. So Washington must realign its ways, means, and ends on Iran policy.
And how would it do this?
In my view, there's a couple of key ways. One, of course, is to empower the International Atomic Energy Agency rather than to subordinate the International Atomic Energy Agency. There are already talks right now, there are already allegations right now in the press that there is a willingness by the EU to kind of push aside the safeguards, the ongoing violations by Iran of its larger non-proliferation agreements related to past undeclared traces of nuclear material. You want to empower those investigations, and you want to put them in the driver's seat, not the deal resurrection talks. Second, you want to be able to take advantage of one of the few things that are good that are built into the deal, such as the snapback mechanism, to restore the multilateral predicate for pressure against the Islamic Republic that existed from 2006 to 2010 at the UN. And this was a time when Russia, China, America, the EU all supported the idea of a permanent arms ban, permanent missile testing ban, and a cessation of enrichment of Iranian soil. These are all things that Iran has won through sustained escalation and negotiations. It's time to restore that predicate, collapse the resolution that enshrines the Iran deal, and show Tehran that we are willing to at least move towards diplomatic and tough economic pressure.
Okay, well, Behnam, thank you for that. Stay with us. I want to bring in the panel now. Amanda, specifically you, I want to ask you about, if potentially the US were to walk away from a nuclear negotiation, the nuclear deal negotiations, how would that impact on the US in terms of its image? Would the international community even side with Washington in that event?
Well, here's the thing, is the conversation around what we're doing with Iran has been a very big conversation in terms of the nuclear deal. So I hear the list of things that should be taken into consideration, but without bringing the public along right now, I don't think you will have a U.S. Congress brought along. And in this case, the administration, any administration you've ever had, has been working very hand in hand with the House and the Senate and foreign intelligence committees, and you're just not seeing a conversation beyond what we can do on the nuclear pact. And so that will be the driving conversation. I don't see it changing, even though this attack happened in New York, right on American soil. I still see the conversation being very much the same. And how do we get to progress on the nuclear deal?
Behnam?
I would respectfully disagree. In fact, over the past year and a half, you've had quite a bit of dissonance, not political dissonance, but policy dissonance between the House and the Senate on one hand and the Biden administration on the other. And what the Biden administration has done is revert to a much older predicate that existed in Washington, which prioritizes the nuclear issue and has the whole lingering architecture of non-nuclear Iranian threats, such as terrorism, missiles, cyber, human rights, money laundering, everything else kind of go by the wayside. And the movement that you have seen with respect to pressure in Congress has been through, on the legislative side, non-nuclear pressure, and on the letter-writing campaign side and attention-raising side, a real call for a plan B, a real call for what comes next, and a real call for clarity over the Biden administration's Iran policy. So I would say that respectfully, there is this desire to try to find out what's next by many voices in Congress, including by prominent Democrats, such as those Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that questioned Robert Malley, the Iran czar of the Biden administration in the State Department on May 25th.
Joe, what do you think? Do you think that that's the way forward?
I think it's extremely difficult to find a way forward, given how long these negotiations have gone on. In public opinion terms, there is support for negotiations in principle, but then when it comes to the actual outcome, there's no real decision on that. And without a particularly concerted view from the public, it's difficult to take a lead for politicians. And so I can't see substantial movement being made in the short term, perhaps even the medium term as well. But at the same time, I don't think that the horrible attack over the weekend on Salman Rushdie will have a major impact on things.
Behnam, one more question to you before you go. The midterms are obviously looming. How much of a worry is this, given what's happening in the next few months?
So the approach the Biden administration appears to be taking with respect to the midterms is to simply keep a cap on the Iranian nuclear program, or at least to create the veneer of a cap on the Iranian nuclear program as the program advances and as the other threats advance. And what that means is to not talk about the deal transformationally, but to talk about it transactionally, and to continue to try to frame the Iran issue within the larger geostrategic threat spectrum of Russia being much larger, of China being much larger. And in this sense, the Biden administration is not drawing on any of the language from the Obama administration that was transformational. And in fact, you may see, if there is a push for a deal or the Iranian position does change between now and November, you may hear about an Iran deal being framed as a potential oil deal, given the lack of U.S. domestic production, the lack of a political desire to deal with Libya, and the lack of an ability to get more Saudi production online after Biden's trip to the region. So the Iran deal may increasingly, if it does happen between now and November, be framed as a little bit of an oil deal, given high oil prices and given, of course, the continued situation with the Russian invasion and war against Ukraine.
OK, Behnam, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming onto The Context and giving us your point of view. Now, world